Hey guys, and welcome back to Storytime with Hollow. As promised, this is part 2 of Right Where We Belong, chapter 7, I believe it is, yes. The name of the chapter, let me just quickly check for you, is Depths. And yeah, we're about halfway through, but it's such a long chapter that I cut it off at a reasonable point for it to sort of be a cliffhanger. And, well, it was one, that's for sure. A lot is about to take place, and I'm excited to read it so that you hear it. Again, if you would like to go back and read it yourself, go ahead. The link to the fanfiction is in the description. Again, it's wrote by Captain Fluke. It's called Right Where We Belong. And yeah, it's pretty fucking awesome. Alright, so let's get into it. Fluke stopped. The others quickly followed suit as their eyes darted around. He turned, his eyes glowing yellow and the lower half of his face covered by a thick cloth. Pointing at his wrist, signalling that the group had almost made it to the location, with only another 40 feet or so to go, and that they had to tread lightly. They all nodded their acknowledgement and continued, the visual range only a couple of feet in front of them in the depths of the cavern. The air was incredibly thick with black dust, and the only visuals they had came from their immediate surroundings. The sky long gone in all directions was a thick, black, constant swirling mess of horror only matched in visuals by the whistle of the wind. All they had to remind them that they were alive. The group trekked on, breathing heavily and completely on edge. For the first time as long as they had been here, there begun to be a source of outside light. A light glow emanated from a few feet in front of them, which got brighter as they stepped ever closer. Its white breaking apart the thick black that had hugged them tightly as they descended into a hell only few had seen. Edging closer, it got brighter like the light at the end of a tunnel. Fluke stopped again, and the others followed suit. In front of them, at the base of the war-created cavern, 100 feet below the surface of the earth in a cracked scar of geology, they stood at the edge of a small white pool of thick, churning liquid. On Fluke's wrist, the blue link blinked repeatedly. They had reached their destination. The group took their tankards off of their backs, each able to hold a few litres of the thick, molasses-like liquid as Fluke and Hollow quickly dipped them into the substance. Its unnatural hue matched by the textures it glooped into the tankards, and the bright white light it gave became sealed in tall steel tubes attached to each of their backs. Hollow filled his, and Fluke as the two stood guard against the invisible enemies as rage and peace begun to fill theirs. The air was picking up as the sun they'd long forgotten shifted, pushed an already dark planet into a darker place. The wind still all they could hear as Fluke and Hollow tightened their fingers on the trigger aiming at invisible enemies. Rage and peace hunched over, filling their tankards slowly and steadily. Hollow stared, his eyes straining through the dim light his mask offered into the darkness. Already feeling like he had been here for too long, he was on edge as the ash danced around him. It wasn't the ash that scared them, it was the horrors it hid. Children's stories rang through his head, as figures would appear and disappear in his peripherals. Another shift among the darting white and black powder that surrounded them, and he tightened his grip further, the chills running from the top of his spine to the centre of his core. He stared into the distance. There was only a few feet from his face, ready. Suddenly, from amongst the circling white, grey and black around him, two dull and rotten white eyes progressed towards him, completely hidden by the smog around them, until a few feet from his person, it emerged. A person, the eyes glowing white with a sense of anger, its face peeling, pale and cold, with hair sparse and matted. Its body hunched and distorted, it creeped towards a frozen Hollow who had only heard stories of those who had lost their lives to the radiation left by the Ragicans. A person where the soul was carved out and all that was left was a husk of a person, a shell, a Hollower. Whether in fear or disbelief, he hesitated as the lumbering person edged closer and closer, its mouth hanging open wider than a human's ever could, as the jaw dislocated, and it let out a startling cry that ripped through the stale air and straight into the heads and hearts of the four. Hollow, shaken out of his stupor, clenched his hand and pulled the trigger, sending a thick electric beam straight through the head of the nearby Hollower before illuminating a good 20 feet in front of them, as another dozen sets of eyes lit up and turned their gaze to the group. Rage and Peace instantly sealed their containers and latched them onto their backs as soon as the first shot was fired. Fluke had already jumped alongside Hollow as they begun to fire into the almost darkness at enemies they could only assume were close. Bright yellow spreads of light and thick blue electric beam were all that could use to illuminate the approaching enemies as they repeatedly fired into dark space. The only gratification when another pair of eyes disappeared. The slow, lumbering figures of the Hollowers edged closer and closer as more attention was brought to the group, with Rage and Peace finally able to get their guns, spark them into life and signal to the other two that they were ready to move. Slowly edging up the path they couldn't see they had begun to head up, Hollow and Peace covered the back, firing round after round into the building's Hollowers, whose ethereal screech permeated the air and cut deep into everyone around. Fluke had returned to the front and flicked the map back up on his wrist, their only guide. They had to get to the top that they had to follow. Rage fired round after round into them from range as the zombie-like ex-humans clambered and climbed on top of each other to reach the group. Very quickly, they were engulfed completely into the smog again, as they lost all sight of the pool of uranium and the surface. Having to stick against the wall tightly and just keep moving, their speed limited by their complete lack of vision, a hand pushed out for a wall next to Fluke, who stumbled, as Rage pulled up his revolvers and fired 3 shots into the wrist, obliterating any previous existence of a Hollower's arm. Hollow and Peace fired as they paced backwards. A seemingly endless supply of these crooked, half people clambered towards them, growing in the number as they fired round after round, Peace's assault rifle firing dozens of green-tinged bullets that tore through the already rotten flesh of the Hollowers, ripping them apart piece by piece as Hollow's thick beam left much larger cuts across the groups. Higher and higher they climbed, carrying what would become powerful explosives on their back. As they stepped up an increasingly high cliff face, defending against an almost invisible enemy, the only sounds they could hear, the sounds of their guns firing, and the cutting scream of the Hollowers as they lay waste to more, adding to a pile of ashen corpse that had already lost past capacity. More and more came, clambering over the torn-through corpses and climbing the cliff face with inch-long claws ripping into the mountainside to scale the surface. The only hope they had to look forward to was keeping those claws away from their own throats. Rage kept firing. More and more had begun to gather around the group and climb down the walls as he fired shot after shot into the air, blowing parts of the Hollowers down upon them. Fluke firing sparingly before checking the map and making sure they were still heading in the right direction, although heading to the surface a few turning, twisting paths stood aloft in the chasm, leaving them at several crossroads they had to navigate to make sure they peaked at the right time. Almost, Fluke thought to himself as they kept on, bullets and screams filling his ears. They crested onto the surface and found themselves in the open. They were close, as the 4 fired round after round into the thick crowd of Hollowers. "They've surfaced, we're lighting up," Pocket shouted down into the hull as she began to flick several switches along the cockpit which illuminated the many panels in front of her, and turned on 2 powerful beams of light at the front of Songbird that tore through the smog into the distance. Upon hearing this, Tide jumped down into his gun seat as the panels above him flipped down and lay in his lap. He descended into the pod that hung beneath the ship as his console locked into the 3 barrels in front of him. Flicking a switch on his own panel, a spotlight now led in front of him as he aimed directly at where the outboard party were coming from, where the small illuminations of red, blue, green and yellow were getting brighter. Pocket sat at the controls of the ship. She'd gone over how to fly countless times, but this was her first real test at the controls, and she was never sure if she was ready. She sighed. Gaining her confidence and remembering all that she'd been told by the pilot she studied under, "You'll only ever fly as good as you think you can," rang in her head as she stared with newfound confidence at the front of the window. Before flicking a switch and allowing the door to open, she was ready. The 4 kept on firing round and round at their surroundings. Just a short run to the ship now and they'd be home free. Fluke, having put away the map, had pulled out his shotgun and joined the others as the swamping Hollowers had begun haunting and crowding them from all sides like a spreading hive mind of horror. They moved, slaughtering dozens as they made their way quickly as they could while sprinting into completely unknown and invisible land, whilst hounded by countless enemies hidden and shrieking in the fog they just couldn't puncture. the dire situation suddenly illuminated by 2 thick beams of light from the front of Songbird as they sprinted the final distance towards it, guns blazing behind them. Hitting the bottom of the ramp, they clambered up into the door as the twisted and scarred arms of the Hollowers reached into the air to grab them. Suddenly, a large booming filled the air as round after round from the turret began tearing through the groups of unnatural pursuers, tearing limbs off in single shots. Tide fired again and again and again, discarding groups as nothing more than paper under his coarse bullets. They boarded, and all 4 turned and pointed their guns at the door, picking off those who had passed the turret. Pocket needed no signal. As she tore the ship into the air, the bright, powerful engines illuminating the enemy that they faced for the first time. Hundreds of lifeless eyes stared up at them. Punching the engines as she took off, as the 4 kept firing at the door, slowly sealing and breaking through the ash and into the sky, as once again a deep silence dropped over the group. As soon as it sealed shut, a deathly silence fell over the group. They'd faced the haunting past of what parts of humanity had become under the war. And this was only the first part of the mission. And that's it. That is the end of Chapter 7, Depths of Right Where We Belong by Captain Fluke. And that's actually all the chapters. That's everything he's wrote so far. And it's depressing as fuck, don't you agree? That there's nothing more. A really cool story. Really cool characters that he's sort of made, because ultimately what he's done is taken our characters, the people we are, and, you know, maybe exaggerated certain points, created a background story. These aren't essentially us. They're characters that he gets to play with baseline personalities of us, and I think it's really cool what he's done. And I just love how the weapons work, and, you know, the whole world in general, and the fact that all the enemies as well are technically our viewers. So everyone's involved, really. So, like, you know, Flukosaurs are Fluke's name for his viewers, and those are like an enemy in the world. And Hollowers that we just explored are my viewers. Pretty fucked up. And then the Regican Empire are Rage's viewers. Really cool stuff. Please leave a like if you've enjoyed the series. I will be back again with Storytime with Hollow in the future when this continues, when he finally writes more. Again, please email him, message him, tweet him about it, how he needs to write more, because I want to read more and I want to show you more. So again, thank you very much for listening and watching the video if you did. I'll see you guys next time and have a great day.